I'm Gabriella Sestero from Southern Coast Community High School. This is my grandfather, George Clays, and this interview is being conducted at my house in South Florida. So, Grandpa George,
Yes.
When and where were you born?
I was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
And when was that?
That was December 4, 1933.
So what was your life like a little bit, just a little?
My life in Canada was such that from the time that I was able to, I had a pair of skates on. And not too far from the house in which I lived, there was a community center which had outdoor skating rinks. And I probably learned how to skate sooner than I learned how to walk.
Oh.
And I remember distinctly, even before I entered into the first grade, that most of my interest was in that skating rink because that was my method of communicating with individuals who were probably older than I was, but it was the sport of hockey was my main interest, even throughout the time I lived in Canada for the 14, 15 years that I was there. I remember getting involved in organized hockey when I was probably 12 years old. Probably less than that, probably 10 years old. They have hockey organizations beginning at an early age, and I couldn't wait till snowfall, which was generally about the 1st of October, and organized hockey continued throughout a period of time, about 3 or 4 months a year. And even as a youth, prior to entering into school, I was playing sort of a semi-organized group, and I hoped one day, as every young Canadian, I hoped one day that maybe I would be good enough to be a National Hockey League player. But that ended, of course, when my family moved to Detroit, Michigan, and there isn't a lot of hockey being played there in a junior type setting.
So why did your family move to Detroit?
My family moved to Detroit because my father was in the construction business, and although he was relatively successful there, he teamed up with a partner of his who he had known for a long time, and they became partners, and they were in the stone slash bricklaying business, and it was an opportunity that didn't exist in Winnipeg because you could only work in that particular field about 8 months a year or so. So it was for his financial benefit to move to Detroit.
Okay. And then you ended up being drafted. When did that happen?
I ended up being drafted. When I was, let me see, I was 22 years old, I believe, when I was drafted. I was drafted in November, and I went into the service shortly thereafter.
Okay. What branch of the military did you
Oh,
end up?
if you're drafted, you're always drafted into the Army.
I'm always drafted.
Always drafted
Okay.
into the Army. If a lot of people during that period of time chose to get into various branches, they join either the Air Force or they join the Navy. They join, and if you join for a 4-year period of time. But by so doing, you're certainly not going to get shot at, because there was the deaths involved among the military, among the Air Force personnel and the Navy personnel was limited. Most of the deaths that took place were among the infantry, and the draftees were generally destined to the infantry because that was a demand when the Korean War existed.
So joining other branches was sort of
joining other branches at least gave you the opportunity to not get physically involved, and of course that was a situation where the draft isn't really fair to a lot of people, because anyone who went to college at that particular time and who was in college didn't get drafted. Now, they were given a different classification. If they went to graduate school, they were given another 2 years. If they got married, they were giving another classification. And if they had children, they were giving a fourth classification. Do you understand? So very often, a lot of people who were able-bodied never went into the military. It was a sort of a draft dodging. It was sort of a draft dodging means, as exists in a lot of the military. The only honest method was during the Second World War, because the military is very dedicated, and most everyone tried to do as much as they can to improve the military situation that existed. But I mean, the Korean War was such that too many people didn't get drafted for various purposes, and that happens all the time. I mean, our president today was a draft dodger, basically. He got 7 deferrals, but how he got a deferral, I will never know.
So what kept you from draft dodging?
Well, I guess I was a patriot.
So when you were drafted,
yes.
Were you comfortable with it, or were you?
Yeah,
scared?
I didn't like being drafted. I thought I was expecting to get drafted a lot sooner than what I did, and kept on. And I thought, geez, maybe they forgot about me. But as the case was, I did, when I was 22 years old, I got a nice letter from the federal government.
And so this you got. When you got the letter, the Korean War was already over.
The Korean War was over, yes.
Did you support the American involvement in the Korean War?
I was opposed to it, like the vast majority of the American public. Yes, I mean, I didn't really approve of it. I knew most people my age at that time knew very little about it, actually.
So, what happened after you were drafted? What did you do after you were drafted?
Well, after I was drafted, when I was drafted, you was given a notice to report to a particular military center for orders to be destined to go to whatever training camp that they decided to send you to.
And can you tell me a little bit about that, like which training camps you went to and what you did while you were there?
The training camp that I went to Fort Carson, Colorado, and I left by train with about I guess about 200-300 people were transferred to the same facility, as well as probably thousands of others from various parts of the United States, because it was a major training center for the infantry and the military at that particular time.
And you said that you said something to your friend when you got there about the weather.
Yeah.
What did you say?
I said to him, I said, here we are in Fort Carson, Colorado in the wintertime. It would have been nice if they would have sent us here during the summer months. I said to him, what we're doing here, we're going to go to Korea. He says it's cold as hell in Korea, and it's going to be, and they're training us for cold weather warfare. And of course, my prognostications were accurate, because that's exactly where we ended up going.
But you said that they were training you for warfare. Was
Yeah.
that so? Even though there wasn't fighting going on,
Oh, they had to train you. We were part of a defense contingent. I mean, if they decided to continue, there really wasn't a formal truce sign. Actually, we're still at war with them today, basically, but there wasn't a formal agreement signed, and we were on the DMZ while we were there, and they could have come across the DMZ at any time, and we were a defense mechanism. That's all we were.
But were you worried about war breaking out when you?
Well, I wasn't worried about it. No, I wasn't worried. I didn't think it would ever happen, nor did anyone else. Because at that particular time, we were well fortified, and more so than we were when the war was actually taking place.
So, where did you end up serving in South Korea, and how did you end up there?
Well, I ended up in the nearest village was a place called Moonsani, and we just went through there. I mean, we never did have any association with the villages or cities. They call it a city, yes, but it was just a small village. That's all, with maybe 400 or 500 residents and living in thatch shack roofs and very primitive environment for them.
But you said you served at Yeongnam-po was the
Yeah.
exact place. So what was your average daily schedule like there? What did you do, and how did you, just an average day for you?
Well, I would say a fraction of the time was spent on so-called maneuvers, where we play so-called war games, and after we left the garrison, and the garrison I mean we lived in Quonset huts. We actually slept in a tent atmosphere. Both you paired up with two men, with one man, and you sleep in a pup tent. You know what a pup tent is? A small tent.
Oh yeah.
We slept in a pup tent with air blankets, air mattress, and blankets, and we oftentimes were out 10 days at a time. And we lived in the field where all the facilities were trucked out. Our arms were trucked out. We all had so-called M1 rifles. Some of the military were trained with 50 caliber machine guns. Some were trained with Browning automatic rifles, BAR rifles, and some had other forms of training. And we went out as a unit prepared for warfare, and we played so-called war games for a period of time, oftentimes shooting at targets and carrying on such as that. Now that was probably the less boring event that one would have, but it also was such that we were living very primitively. It was even, I mean, living in a garrison in so-called Quonset huts were bad enough, but when you lived out in the field, I mean, you had to contend with the elements like the rain and whatever else, and of course, I mean the bathing facilities were little, and you know, I mean, you got so used to it that it was just a day's activity.
You were telling me earlier about the water and how little water there was. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, there was just so much water tanked in on a weekly basis, and most of the water was set aside for drinking purposes. Bathing purposes, I mean, other than during the winter months, it was such that, I mean, you had to do as little as you could with the water that you had, and there was no water available other than, as I said, in the summer months you could bathe in the river that was about a quarter of a mile away from us. It wasn't advised that you drank that water because it could have been contaminated, and they didn't want us to drink the water, and we bathed in it, we swam in it, but that was the extent of our bathing facilities, the river, and what little we were able to get from the facility in which we lived in. There wasn't any drinking water anywhere in that particular area. The indigenous people, the Koreans, they had wells. Now, we didn't use the wells because it was thought that the wells would probably be contaminated, and we weren't permitted, or we were advised, drinking any of the water.
Were you able to interact much with these Koreans?
They didn't speak English, and we didn't speak Korean, so the interaction was zero.
but you told me about these Koreans who served in the army with you.
The Koreans that served in the army, they served with us as military assistants. They spoke limited English, but enough to understand the order of the day. And we didn't have a problem with them in any way, shape, or form. They were probably happier to be with us than with their own Korean units, because they probably treated us better, and they got paid by the military for being a part of our contingent while in Korea.
What were they called again?
They were called Katusas.
Okay. So, what was where you were stationed like? Was there evidence of occupation by the North Koreans?
There was no evidence of occupation whatsoever with the North Koreans. We never set foot in beyond north of the demilitarized zone. We never had contact with the North Koreans, nor with they with us. It was prohibited, and there was barricades, so that there was no associations at all with either the North Koreans or even the indigenous South Koreans that lived not too far from where we were stationed.
So the North Koreans really didn't have any influence
No,
on
none at all.
Were you able to really see the country of South Korea? Were you able to see it reconstruct itself since you were there after the Korean War?
Well, the situation was such that we were in an area where if there was warfare taking place, it was not visible.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of that which we saw was in hills and valleys and vacant land. There was no buildings at all in the immediate area, other than small villages which probably held more than 300 or 400 people. And oftentimes these little villages, they weren't even named. The larger ones that I remembered, I gave as Yeongdongpo, and the other one that I don't quite remember or able to pronounce.
While you were there, were you able to visit Seoul or any other?
I visited Seoul on two different occasions when I was there. On one occasion that I remember was getting leave on one particular weekend when we were permitted to do so. They have provisions for people that are not stationed in Seoul. They have provisions for overnights for people that are stationed in other parts. And I think I spent one night there, and the other time I was in Seoul was when I was en route to Japan on leave, and other places that I spent while traveling during the military.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was the South Korean people's, what were their sentiment towards the North Korean people?
Well, the situation was such that I mean, there's animosity between the North and the South. At one particular time, after the war, after the First World War, the entire peninsula of Korea was occupied by the Japanese. This was during the Second World War. The Japanese occupied the entire peninsula at that particular time. When the Second World War ended, the Chinese made an effort to occupy the entire peninsula, because the Chinese were actively involved in the Korean War. They furnished about 90% of the personnel, along with arms, as well as Russia supplied arms to the North Koreans, as well as, and they moved into the entire area, and they dominated the entire peninsula for a period of time, until the United States was able to, and the United Nations decided that They objected to the communist regime of that particular area, and that's why the war started. It was a territorial war, and it was such that there was only one way to remove them, and that was by forceful means.
So what did the natives in South Korea and Yeongdeung-ho, like, what did they think of you, their American occupiers?
Well, I mean, we were there. They knew the purpose of our being there, but like any nation, they don't like foreign forces occupying their land, and their customs are entirely different. Their culture is different, and they tolerated us. They knew the reason why we're there, but they did not. And of course, they benefited by us being there because the Americans were subsidizing the entire country, and by so doing, it bettered their lives in some manner that I'm not familiar with.
So what did you and your fellow soldiers then think of the South Koreans? Like, did you have any opinion of them?
Well, they basically had a neutral feeling. I mean, their interest was survival for the most part, particularly those who were involved in the warfare and getting home. I mean, they were very unhappy about being there, number one, and number two, those that were there, such as myself during the occupation, I mean, felt that it was somewhat of a waste because there was 40,000 American troops there, and oftentimes you wonder, why are there so many Americans doing over here? And it was such that it was a total bore throughout the period of time, and it was only because we were trying to be defensive in case they decided not to go with the agreement that took place during the signing of the so-called truce that took place maybe 2 or 3 years prior to that.
So you just weren't very happy being there, from what I gather.
No question about that. Myself nor anyone else.
Did you express this sentiment to your parents and friends? Were you in contact
Oh
with
yeah,
them?
sure. I mean, anyone that was drafted and was there, they certainly weren't happy about it. They would rather have remained in the United States, or maybe some other country that was friendly to the United States. Korea was the least desirable assignment that anyone could possibly get.
Really?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're luckily there. You're only there for 2 years. People just couldn't wait to get back home.
So you said you were in contact with your parents and friends. Like, how did you keep in contact with
By
them?
letter,
By letter.
by mail. Only by mail, right. There's no means of telephone. No.
And how often did you keep in contact with them?
Well, I wasn't a writer, but I probably wrote them once a month. Yeah.
And what kind of things did you write about?
Well, typically the conditions, missing the United States, and the luxuries.
So are there any conditions really that you didn't describe yet about your stay in South Korea?
They were primitive. You get used to it. You're there long enough, and it's a daily routine.
And what exactly how long were you there for, like the exact dates?
I was there for about 18 months.
18 months?
Something like that, yeah.
Do you remember from what
dates? I arrived there during the spring because I knew it was muddy and there was a lot of rain during that period of time. We got off the boat, we were ankle deep in slush.
Spring of what year?
And dirt. And that must have been in April. And I was there for 2 winters, I believe.
So while you were there, was there any sort of problems that you experienced just either with Native people or with your
we
fellow
have, I had myself or anyone else had very limited contact with any of the Native Koreans.
But what about with each other? Were there problems?
Oh well, I mean, there's always when you have a group of men, you always decide who you want to associate with and who you don't want to associate with, and that's the way the situation is. You go to the dining room table and the same guys sit at the same table all the time.
So did you really make strong bonds with anyone there?
Yeah, you will always have very good friends, sure. You always have good, you have 2 or 3 guys that you stick up to, take care of each other.
And did you keep in contact with them afterwards?
From time to time, yeah, right.
Still talk to them?
Whenever I had leave, I always traveled with one or two people, yeah.
So is there anything that we haven't discussed that you would like to elaborate on about your service in South Korea?
Well, I'll tell you something that you probably don't want to record. But this was a situation where, you have 200 men thereabouts, and you have latrines, and latrines are located. You know what a latrine is, don't you? Latrines are located on an elevated area, and the latrines were houses that they were about they were probably about a 28 almost 20 seaters, and they were huge, and they were there for a long period of time, and you know what methane gas is, don't you? Okay. Well, a few of us went to the motor pool one day, and we got a mixture of gas, and we got gasoline and oil. And the motor pool is where all the vehicles are, and where all the whatever, and trucks and deuce and a halves, and we we're going to clean the latrine out a little bit. So we spread all this. All the openings. We spread all the openings and threw some match down there, and nothing happened. Waited a second. We all walked in, and about that time, it blew up. It lifted. These things are big. It lifted that whole building about a foot off the ground, and it appeared as though it was going to roll down the hill. And the explosion was heard all over the camp, and no one knew what the hell was happening. And myself and a half a dozen people were involved in that, and we were called to the carpet because of something like that. But at least it's cleaned it out somewhat, and luckily it fell right down in place. So that was the most exciting experience I ever had while there.
Did you ever get in any trouble?
No.
So things like that. Like, what did you do for leisure while you were there?
Play poker. That's about
That's it.
And drank beer. There was up above. We were in a hilly area, and up above the Quonset huts. We every Wednesday night was beer night, and it wasn't all you can drink, but most people tried to consume as much as they could. And that's about the extent of it. It was only available on a Wednesday night. Learned how to smoke cigarettes, because that's what everyone did at the time.
So, how did your service end in South Korea? What happened?
Well, as I mentioned to you, I injured my back
Mm-hmm.
on a particular routine that we had, and there's no X-rays. There was a doctor in the unit. We had a unit where there was a doctor, but I mean, he didn't have X-ray facilities. I was sent to the regional area, and X-rays took X-rays of my back, and there was nothing obvious, because X-rays don't don't have anything to do with soft tissue, it's just hard tissue. We didn't have MRIs at that time or any other sophisticated types of means of photographing your body. And I was transferred to another area for about 2 weeks or so, in which I did absolutely nothing because I could hardly get out of bed and hardly walk. And it was about a month later. I was going to get discharged anyway, and they shipped me to Japan along with several other people, and they looked at it further, and they told me that I'd be better off just following up when I got back to the United States, which I didn't do. And about 10 years later, I ended up having surgery on that back. In fact, I ended up having 3 surgeries throughout that period of time.
Should have gotten it checked sooner. Should have gotten it checked sooner.
Yeah.
But so when you got home, what did you feel like you accomplished being stationed in South Korea?
Well, I was not happy about it, but the fact was the benefits that I received were minimal. I was glad to get home. Didn't resent being there, you know.
No.
The only thing I did resent is when I got out, I didn't get a discharge as such. I mean, you were still obligated to remain in the military, and you had to attend summer camp for a period of about 3 years thereafter. Meaning we're just going through the same routine.
And you still had to do that with your back?
I was all right then.
Oh, okay.
My back was all right. No, I had surgery after that period of time, but from the time I was discharged until the time I had surgery, I did have back problems from time to time. But every year I had to go to a camp in Georgia near Camp I forget someplace near Columbus, Georgia.
What did your family and friends think of your service? Were you received in a particular way when you returned?
No.
Was it just
no
common?
one. I mean, the military wasn't thought too much of during that Korean War. It was a sort of a lost war.
Yeah.
I mean, we just 10 years prior to that, we ended the Second World War. That was bad enough. But no, it was a situation where they weren't given any special recognition.
So how did you end up in Florida after?
Well, after I got discharged, at that period of time, my mother and father moved from Detroit to Pompano Beach, and I visited them after I got out. I was going to stay in Detroit, but I visited them, and I decided I was going to get into the real estate business, and I took the necessary testing after going to school for a period of time. I got a real estate license and began working for the individual who I worked for about 7 or 8 years. Then I started my own business while I was in Cocoa Beach. I worked in Fort Lauderdale for about 5 or 6 years, and I moved to Cocoa Beach sometime maybe about 1963 through 1969. I remained in Cocoa Beach thereafter. I thereafter came to Boca Raton and been there ever since.
I remember you saying when I was younger, you said something along the lines of the weather in South Korea is what caused you to move to Florida. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What your exact words were?
Well, I don't really remember, but the weather was not that penetrating because I was really used to the cold anyway, coming from a place like Winnipeg, Manitoba, because very often during the winter months, temperatures got as cold as 20, 30 degrees below zero. So I was quite used to and quite familiar with cold weather and how to react to it. But my move was particularly to see my parents and see how they were, because they were getting older, and I had to decide what I was going to do with myself, make a living, etc. And the real estate business was such where there was an opportunity in Florida because of the growth that was going to take place here, that was taking place here. And I got a real estate license, and then finally a broker's license, and finally retired.
So how has your service impacted your thoughts on war in general in the U.S. military?
Well, I think negotiation and working out a situation is much better than going through the armed process, because nothing worse than getting into a conflict where many people get killed.
And what about on the U.S. military, and to be specific?
Well, U.S. military, oftentimes, if the problem can't be solved by negotiations, sometimes there's no other choice but military conflict.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the last resort.
Yeah. So how has the service impacted your life, besides the back incident?
Well, I mean, it's bad that during a person's lifetime, it's bad that there's so much conflict in the world. Mm-hmm. It's bad that so much material matters are spent. So many other things can be done for the betterment of man than going to war and spending billions, trillions of dollars to protect one's well-being. That's the saddest thing about the military and the conflict that takes place in the world. There's just too much differences that can't be resolved by negotiation that should take place. I mean, you know, one third of our budget, or 25% of our budget, goes to the military. I mean, that seems ridiculous, but that has been our matter for many years. Think of all that money that could be spent elsewhere.
So finally, do you have a specific message for future generations? Maybe two specific messages. One specifically about the involvement in the military, and then one just about life in general.
Well, as I said, there is altogether too much conflict in the world, and I think matters should be and could be taken care of by people of sound minds without having to use force. And the force that is used nowadays is such that it's so destructive that millions of people can die because of a move that is taken, that could take place by some individual leader of some individual country. It's a serious matter that should be resolved in other ways.
So you're not a big fan of war, from what I can gather?
No.
But then, do you have any general message, something that you would like for our generation? Anything you would like to share with us?
Well, the problem in the world today is there's too much poverty, and I guess we get spoiled in the United States because it's difficult to realize that there are people in the world that, and probably one third of the country, one third of the populace in the world lives, and it has living standards that are so bad. And you know, the United States is so prosperous that we should be able to, through means, do a lot more for the underprivileged. I was just looking at a program the other day, and Bill Gates himself, Bill Gates is the founder of Microsoft. He himself has spent the past year $40 billion, and almost 90% of it went to countries of limited means, Africa and other countries, primarily to improve their health and well-being through healthcare methods. Now, if the United States, in their goodness, could set aside X number of dollars on a regular basis to poorer countries like this, that I think we would have much greater esteem than we do in confronting people and being authoritarian to some respect.
Mm-hmm. You once described the people in South Korea as living in not even third world conditions, but fourth world conditions. Do you think seeing that impacted the way that you think we should treat?
I mean, the contrast is so great to what Korea looks like today. And my understanding is the United States, in their goodness and their generosity, has had a lot to do with Korea being what it is today. Korea has been, the past 25 years, the fastest growing country in the world. I mean, they are so high tech. The buildings in there, the highest building in Korea when I was there was about a 6-story wooden structure where the dictator president was resided. Today, I've seen pictures of it, and it's unbelievable how that country has developed in such a short period of time. They couldn't do it by themselves. They had to do it with help from the United States. The United States subsidized it in a lot of respects, and it is proven that a little help from friendly nations can do a great bit of good, rather than the warring that exists today. It's terrible, you know. Everyone's at each other's throats today for no reasons whatsoever.
And now to end, is there anything that you just like to add that you weren't able to say, or do you think you got it all out?
No, I've said. Would you like to?
Oh, I think they're asking if
like to go back.
Well, I doubt you'd like to go back to wartime, but if you had the opportunity, like say that you had the opportunity to go somewhere else. I know you don't have a choice when you're drafted, but like say you could have gone to Canada instead of been drafted.
I accepted being drafted. Sure, I didn't object. I mean, I had friends of mine who got drafted earlier and got in and were injured during the Korean War. No, I could have gone back to Canada, but I wouldn't do that. Mm-hmm. No. I would accept anything that's you're obligated to. If you're an American citizen and you get drafted, you do your duty, you keep your mouth shut. You don't complain.
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for your stories.
Yeah.
All good.
Now,